Hey guys, welcome back to another Why No One Plays episode. Hope everyone's been enjoying the 3.0 update so far with Sumeru, the Dendro update and whatnot. If you remember in the previous installment featuring Sayu, I mentioned how I was gonna hold off on making a video on Thoma until after Dendro was released because there was bound to be a lot of units getting indirectly buffed from Bloom and Quicken, and I thought it would be an interesting way to format his episode in a no one plays him, but here's a way he could be worth trying out type of way. And sure enough, that opportunity did surface. So for today's episode, we're gonna be going over Child if instead of being a serial killer, he was a house husband, Thoma. Really quickly though, I got something interesting for you guys today. This video is sponsored by Dragon City, which is hosting a collaboration with The Walking Dead, and I believe it's midway through season 11. Dragon City is a free-to-play mobile game available on all devices. You can collect over 1,000 dragons with different elements and rarities to build an entire army by training them, breeding them, yes there's mating in this game, and gathering resources. Very similar to a city building type game, you can field your dragons in PvP battles such as the Master Arenas where you can pit your own squad against other players. Alongside that, like most other city building games, you can join an alliance and cooperate in group activities to get free goodies. The big special though that I mentioned earlier is that they're bringing in characters from the popular TV show The Walking Dead featuring Rick, Maggie, Carol, Daryl, Michonne, Negan, pretty much the entire main cast, but in the form of dragons. If you want to collect all the exclusive Walking Dead dragons, you can use the QR code on screen or my link in the description, and it comes with a free starter pack with 15,000 food, 30,000 gold, and because it's appropriate, a free epic zombie nature dragon. Thanks again to Dragon City for sponsoring the video, but for now let's get back into it. This will be the 6th Pyro character I've made at Why No One Plays on, which is ironic with how Pyro was considered one of the strongest elements early on in Genshin's timeline. Out of all of them, Thoma, alongside Xinyan, has always struck me as confusing in regards to his design. Thoma was one of the few characters who could very well have been pronounced dead on arrival, and has pretty much stayed dead for the majority of players. I would go so far as to say he's one of the most unfortunate characters in the game if we take into account the timing of his debut, the circumstances of his gameplay, and even player perception of him, each playing a major part in why there was hardly any attention given to him. What affected his representation, or lack thereof, was the combination of in-game problems and public opinion towards him. I think it would be wise to go through the latter first, given that it sets the rest of the video. To sum it up, Thoma is a fantastically designed character on a conceptual level, but he was implemented into a setting that can't make the most of his talents, literally. He's a dual-purpose character. Having multiple functions can be a double-edged sword if not designed correctly. An example of a character with great dual purpose is Bennett. Fantastic Voyage provides an immense attack boost and periodic regeneration through the same ability. Thanks to how the attack boost can reach and scale, you're able to increase both parameters without sacrificing efficiency in either one. The accessibility in combination with overly generous ratios and universal benefits is what makes Bennett such a valuable asset to have. But what lends more credence to its widespread use is that what he does is exactly what is needed for the situations where he would want to do those things. He belongs to the Pyro element. Other Pyro characters can take the massive attack bonus from Bennett and amplify it even further through their reactions. Thoma, on the other hand, has a kit that's counterintuitive to Pyro's win condition as an element, not just in terms of what his dual purposes are, but also his power budget. Say you're a DPS character and your only purpose is to deal damage. All of your power budget is then allocated towards DPS. That includes your Ascension stat, passive talents, constellations, even the numbers on your elemental skill and burst. You might be putting all your eggs into one basket, but that also means you will more likely than not always have more eggs in that basket than someone who has to split their resources among 2 or more. Hypothetically, if you have dual functions like power and defense, that means half of your resources are delegated to one and half are delegated to the other. Wearing multiple hats may initially seem very appealing, but there's a reason the term jack of all trades, master of none exists. Most of the time, you can get a lot more results from being good at one thing than being average at many things. Thoma's identity is split into 2 halves. One half is all about defensive support. Blazing Blessing deals a minuscule amount of pyro damage before creating a shield for the active character. The gimmick surrounding the shield is that it's stackable, and through continuous activation of Fiery Collapse, you can theoretically have a shield up indefinitely if I'm not mistaken. At full power, Thoma's shield is considerably strong. Rank 13, it's over 5,000 base plus 44% of his max HP. If you so choose, you can spec full HP on Thoma and give your team almost the same invincibility as Zhongli. Not as instantaneous, and quite frankly, unless you actively avoid taking damage to stack up his shield, you'll probably take more damage than you can regenerate, but that's besides the point. As for the other half being damaged, the source of his off-field pressure stems from his burst. While active, normal attacks are followed up by a blast of pyro damage in an area before forming a shield. Thoma essentially has an elemental burst reminiscent of Xingqiu's or Yelan's. Ordinarily, that sounds like a very appealing premise. Characters with a burst that create follow-up elemental damage are automatically viewed as more useful due to contributing DPS without having to be on the field themselves, while also being easier to control than persistent effects through being activated by a trigger and not always being in effect. But this actually hurts Thoma's viability more than it helps because Pyro was not known for that sort of playstyle. It still isn't. If I could draw a parallel between Thoma and another character, I would choose Diona. Both of their elemental bursts provide a token amount of elemental damage, in that signature mix deals cryo damage every second to enemies standing within it, while Crimson Oyodoi projects a wave of fire every second after a normal attack. They can then provide different benefits based on constellations. Diona grants bonus elemental mastery, while Thoma's Blazing Barrier increases your auto attack damage. Diona is considered by many to be a very good support. Not the best, mind you, but certainly proficient at what is expected of her. She provides ample sustenance and defense, some nice utility, and her burst can contribute very well to chain freeze. Thoma, on the other hand, prior to version 3 was considered by many to be a terrible support, potentially one of the worst in the game. How can they be so different if they have more or less the same premise? See, up until Dendro's official integration into Genshin, Pyro was always the element being enabled rather than the element doing the enabling. Any Pyro-based interactions or strategies revolved around setting Pyro up to deal as much explosive damage as possible. The element's primary win condition is to get as many powerful blasts as possible to capitalize on as many vaporize or melt reactions for optimal DPS. Pyro, as an archetype, is all about damage. The design philosophy surrounding the existing pool of characters posits an emphasis on raw strength. That's what fire is known for in video games. It's the element of power. From observing its base numbers and the ways pyro damage is applied, Thoma's fiery collapse doesn't appear to follow that principle of being the recipient of setup. Quite the opposite, it comes off as a setup ability, and that's exactly what it is. Amplifying reactions like melt and vaporize, the ones that multiply damage, are more rotation sensitive than transformative reactions. For vaporize teams, you want the source of pyro damage to trigger vaporize despite only getting a 1.5 times multiplier instead of double, because the source of pyro damage is usually the one most suited towards optimal increase, such as Wu Tao or Shangling. At rank 13, each wave of fire from Thoma's burst dishes out only 123% in damage, barely stronger than a regular auto attack. His passive Talon Flaming Assault does increase the damage from Fiery Collapse based on your max health as a way for you to convert some of that HP into damage, but it's only 2.2%, that's not significant enough to make a difference. In essence, Thoma contradicts the prevailing wisdom of Pyro as an element and his characters. It doesn't feel like he was ever meant to deal damage. Personally speaking, I think there was a lot more focus placed on the shielding and buffing aspect of its design rather than doing DPS. Because he's a Pyro character though, everyone was understandably yet incorrectly evaluating him on the basis of how well he contributes to his team's overall damage, on account of that being the expected purpose of Pyro characters up until that point. And everyone was disappointed by his failure to do so, even though that's not what he was really designed to do. That's why there's a stark contrast between him and Diona in value, among other things which I'll talk about later. Diona's gradual periodic application of cryo is appreciated thanks to freeze and superconduct not caring a whole lot about how much damage it's doing. Pyro, on the other hand, lives and dies by vaporize and melt, whose damage is entirely dependent on the triggering attack being as strong as possible prior to being multiplied. For better or worse, its reactions are exclusively predicated on sheer force, bringing us to the second problem with Thoma. For a Pyro character especially, he's egregiously lacking in damage. Fiery Collapse can only be triggered once per second, projecting a cone of flames in a target direction. The effect follows the default internal cooldown of 2.5 seconds or 3 hits, whichever comes first. In this case, it would be 2.5 seconds. What this means is that Thoma's follow-up pyro damage can only trigger a reaction every third wave, making the other two waves basically worthless beyond their own damage output. Contrast this to Xingqiu and Yelan's elemental bursts, which do have internal cooldowns. However, theirs, as you know, fire multiple instances of Hydro in a single round, allowing them to bypass the internal cooldown by getting several hits off in a single rotation. As a reminder, it's either 2.5 seconds or 3 hits, whichever comes first. This allows Xingqiu and Yelan to set up Hydro for the next round of Vaporize to their Pyro damage dealer very quickly. Meanwhile, Thoma is hard capped at every third wave since it counts as only one instance of Pyro. As for Shangling, the damage from Pyronado has no internal cooldown, meaning it can trigger Vaporize as fast as you can apply Hydro, combined with Snapshot predetermining its damage for the entirety of the duration, and that's why Shangling is one of the most overpowered units in Genshin. Thoma's Fiery Collapse, on the other hand, does not Snapshot, as it behaves in the same fashion as Yelan and Xingqiu's bursts, with the exception of being gated by an internal cooldown. Then again, all of these factors wouldn't be much of a problem if his numbers were considerably high. But unlike those three, Thoma is a dual-purpose character who doesn't have the concessions a dual-purpose character needs to be successful. That brings us to the second problem with Thoma's burst. It's really weak. Like the damage itself, it's awful even for a 4-star. The shielding capability is very consistent and quite effective, but I'm afraid more of his power budget was allocated to shielding and not a whole lot to attacking. With Constellation 2, you can get up to 18 waves of fire over 18 seconds. Assuming a level 13 elemental burst, that's 123.25% times 18, which equals to 2218.5% in total damage. Sounds impressive on paper, but how does it stack against other bursts? Xiangling's Pyronado lasts 14 seconds and gets off roughly about 12 rounds of damage assuming you're not rotating anti-clockwise, in which case I've heard you can get up to 15 to 16. Let's go with 12 for now though. Just from base numbers, that's 12.232.9%, which totals just under 2800. It doesn't look like a steep drop until we factor in Pyronado's ability to snapshot and the complete absence of an internal cooldown. So it's more like Thoma's 3300% versus Xiangling's 9000, perhaps even more. These are rudimentary calculations, not meant to be taken at face value. It's only to give you an idea of the disparity between them. The argument in defense of Thoma's exceedingly lower damage output is of course his shielding, and I just went over how Thoma doesn't appear to be intended to deal damage. While the defense is certainly helpful, you would get way more mileage out of a dedicated healing support and a dedicated attack support than you would two supports who are split between the two. At the current moment, Thoma has roughly 60% of his budget poured in defense and 40% poured into offense, but his type of design should at the very least be 70 to 80% in both. Otherwise, he falls into the problem of being a decent character, but there are so many better options out there, especially for Pyro. While this doesn't detract from Thoma's usability, comparatively, Bennett and Xiangling set a benchmark so ridiculously high for Pyro supports that anyone who wants to be even remotely considered over those two has to either be extremely unique or of the same caliber of broken as them. Unfortunately, that's kinda how things are for Pyro right now. All other 4-star Pyro characters who aren't Xiangling or Bennett don't get played as much because they're not Xiangling or Bennett, and they don't offer enough of a pragmatic incentive for players to use them. Thoma was affected the worst in that regard. If you were looking for someone who could protect his team, you had Bennett, who also offered a massive attack steroid. If you were looking for a Pyro sub-DPS, you had Xiangling, whose Pyronado is an infinitely better version of Fiery Collapse. When he was released, neither of Thoma's virtues were a novelty. When it comes to Pyro, Genshin kinda shot itself in the foot by releasing 3 characters, 2 of which are very accessible 4-stars that cover 3 major classes: Hu Tao for main DPS, Xiangling for off-field or sub-DPS, and Bennett for support. This means every Pyro unit that comes after will automatically be gauged in efficiency relative to those 3, and if they fail to achieve at least a marginally similar output, there's not a compelling or practical reason to swap out the big 3. If we go back to the parallel between Thoma and Diona, the competition for cryo supports is tighter even though there are so many because there's no cryo version of Bennett or Xiangling. Therefore, Diona's aspects stand out. In totality, Thoma suffers from objectively abysmal numbers across the board. His playstyle is not conducive to Pyro's general win condition, nor does it take full advantage of its amplifying reactions, and the element he belongs to is dominated by 3 characters released very early on who take care of roughly 90% of everything Pyro units are asked to do. The only one who managed to find a niche to call hers was Yoimiya, and even then it's a very small one. It's a hard statement, but there was no way he was gonna come close to relevance, even if we doubled his shield values and pyro damage. Long before he was even added to the game, Thoma stood no chance. At least, not until Sumeru. While it's not a direct one, Pyro did receive a new reaction through Bloom. Combining Dendro with Hydro spawns a Dendro core on the ground for 6 seconds, and you can supplement an additional element to achieve different effects. The one in particular that influences Thoma's viability for the better is Burgeon. Most of the time, a hard internal cooldown is a bad thing. When I say hard, I mean the time-based internal cooldown, which is what Thoma's is. It hamstrings your DPS output, and there's no way for you to circumvent it. But with the way Burgeon works, Thoma's internal cooldown works to his advantage. Burgeon's a transformative reaction, so it's closer to overload than it is to vaporize or melt. That means the triggering attack's damage doesn't matter at all, it's based on elemental mastery. As such, the only thing that matters for transformative reactions is just getting the reaction off. Pyro has another reaction with Dendro, Burning, but the damage from Burning is awful. Thoma's Pyro damage is spaced out just enough to where he's able to consistently proc Burgeon, whereas Xiangling may unintentionally proc Burning. That's not to say this propels Thoma's damage contribution to the same level as her, but it does allow for a niche where he excels at, and that's the important part. So through sheer luck, he was able to pinpoint the one blind spot of Xiangling and Bennett's near total coverage: controllable extended release of Pyro damage. The one thing Bennett lacks is Pyro application. He's for all intents and purposes a walking food dish, just pure attack boost and healing. Xiangling's Pyronado can very well be regarded as a flawless ability, but the one downside to it is that it's involuntary application of Pyro. The Beyblade spins around you on its own. It's not like Xingqiu or Yelan where theirs is tied to an input. It's still too early to tell, but perhaps we may see more uses of Thoma in the coming future. That said, it only addresses half of his problems. Sure, there's now a Pyro reaction that synergizes well with his gameplay, but it doesn't resolve his unacceptably low numbers. I'm not saying he's unusable, everyone can become decent with a good weapon, artifacts, and maxed out constellations and talents, but honestly it makes no sense as to why they gave him so little damage, especially for a Pyro character. That reminds me, I was talking to some theory crafters about this, and we were humoring the notion that Thoma would have been way more in his element, no pun intended, if he was a Cryo or Dendro character with the exact same kit. We don't have any follow-up Cryo attacks yet, so if instead of a wave of fire it was a wave of ice, you could slap on Xingqiu and or Yelan's burst plus Thoma's burst, and basically allow your main DPS to solo permafreeze. Or if he was a Dendro unit, he would have been perfect at setting up Bloom or Quicken. In fact, I wonder if other characters I made a Why No One Plays episode on would have become significantly more popular if they were a different element, or maybe a different weapon type. Might be a fun thought experiment. Anyways, I'm rambling at this point, so we're gonna end things off here. Let me know your thoughts on Thoma in the comments down below, including if you believe version 3 might turn him into a meta character or not. Apart from that, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my previous Why No One Plays episodes if you haven't yet. As a reminder, don't forget to check out Dragon City using the QR code on screen or using the link in the description below. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.